Hi everyone. So in this video, we're going to be talking about a thesis, the thesis. What is a thesis? Why it's important? What makes a good thesis? Because a thesis is really core to your essay assignment. If I had you in a class, I would usually ask the question, what is a thesis? And a lot of times students will say it's what you're going to write about, which on some level is true, but it goes a little bit deeper than that because a thesis is actually the idea that you want to be proving. It's something that's going to require some explanation. That's what the essay is really for. And so keep this in mind that the essay is really there to prove the thesis. Okay, that's all an essay is. It is all this writing there to prove a thesis. If you don't have a thesis, you aren't going anywhere, right? You don't really need the entire essay there. So keep that in mind. That's really important. An essay is just all of these words meant to prove that the thesis actually makes some sense. Even if you are going to just be telling a story about yourself, you're writing an essay that tells a story about yourself, you're going to want to have a thesis. What is it you want to really say about yourself? And so let's look at what Tan is doing. I mentioned that we would talk about that and talk about her thesis. And you see what I have here in the first couple of paragraphs, in the second paragraph of Tan's essay, I had this highlighted. She says, and I use them all of the Englishes I grew up with. And I don't think that's her complete thesis, right? But you can see how that's an idea that she needs to prove throughout. The idea that she has used all of these Englishes to help her in her writing. I mentioned in one of the previous videos that she uses what we call an implied thesis. That is, she doesn't necessarily state the entire thesis. I think this is a component of her thesis, but there are other things that she doesn't state as directly. That is, she doesn't talk about how the fact that even though the a language that she learned from her mother is seen as somehow broken or limited or whatever word that she's going to be using there that she doesn't like, even that kind of language is still going to be important. And so I think if we add that, then we can say that that is her entire thesis. And again, it is okay for writers to not have their entire thesis, to not state it directly, as long as it is there. For you guys just starting out, I want to make sure that you state your theses very directly, because if you don't, then it's easy to forget what you're writing about. It's easy to forget to put it there. So I want to make sure that you state it all very, very clearly. So she does have a thesis here. That is, she uses all these Englishes, even these Englishes that are seen as limited or broken, that are somehow seen as inferior. She feels that they're actually going to be useful. And so when we add all that together, that's going to be part of her thesis. And all of her essay is proving that point. She gives examples of how her mother actually speaks. She gives examples of things that she's actually included in the Joy Luck Club, all of those kinds of things that show something about that language that she's learned to speak, how some people might see it as limited, but how she has used it very successfully as a writer. So we can think about that as being her thesis here. Let's look about what we're going to be writing about for a thesis for our essays. So I say here, what is a good thesis? I say, of course, a good thesis needs to respond to the topic given in the assignment. So that's, again, what students will often say to me if I say, what's a thesis? They say, that's what you're supposed to be writing about for this. And so that's true. But I say, however, it must also be something that requires evidence to prove that it's true. Realize that the only reason an essay exists is to prove the thesis. So the thesis controls everything that will be included in the essay. All right. So again, like I said before, the only reason we have an essay is because we have a thesis that needs to be proved, and everything in there is proving that. And if you sometimes have issues figuring out what you're supposed to be writing about, it might be because you don't have a strong thesis. You aren't clear. Wait, what am I supposed to be proving here? So let's look at some examples about what can make a good thesis for this language and identity project. So I say, for example, a poor thesis. Let's look at a bad one first. A poor thesis for the language and identity writing project would be, my family is from Jamaica, but I grew up in the United States. And since I didn't visit Jamaica much as a child, I never learned to speak the Jamaican patois that most of my cousins in Jamaica speak. Jamaican patois, if you don't know, is it's a version of English, but it is very difficult for people who don't know how to speak it to understand it. It sounds in many ways like a different language. And so talking about Jamaican patois would fit the requirements of the assignment. But look what I say here. I say this is a poor thesis. So be clear that this is, don't follow this model. This isn't a good one. I say this is a poor thesis because even though it might be true that you never learned to speak Jamaican patois, there's really nothing to be proved here, right? Because this person just states a fact. I grew up in the United States and I didn't learn to speak that. Okay, so what are you proving there? And I said, I guess you could have quotes from various family members who say that you don't actually know how to speak Jamaican patois, but that's not really much of an essay, certainly not a 750-word essay. So, see, there's nothing to prove because this person just states facts. I grew up in the United States, and so I didn't learn how to speak Jamaican patois. And so there's not much to say about that. There's no essay there. So let's look at what a better thesis would be, one that clearly sets up a 750-word essay. Because I was born and raised in the United States and didn't visit Jamaica much as a child, I never learned to speak the Jamaican patois that most of my cousins in Jamaica speak. This has caused me not only to feel like an outsider in my family, but also disconnected from my Jamaican heritage. So, see, I've added some extra information in here. Let's think about why this is good. I say this is a good thesis because it will require a lot of explanation to prove that it is true. The writer would need to show us how and why they feel like an outsider in their family and disconnected from their Jamaican heritage. You have to show that that's actually what's happening. Okay, and it's very different from saying I don't speak the language, right, which is just a fact, from this is how I feel about not speaking the language, and that's what I want you to focus on. So I say this will require some family history, possibly explaining why the writer didn't see their Jamaican relatives often and why the writer didn't have Jamaican friends in the United States. The writer would also need to show us exactly what it feels like to be excluded by telling us stories of the patois speaking cousins having private jokes or maybe making fun of the writer, right, feeling excluded from those cousins. And the writer would need to explain what it feels like to be disconnected from their Jamaican heritage and what kind of connection they wish they had. It could easily take 750 words to explain that. So, again, just understanding this second part is very different. That's the kind of thing that I want to make sure that you're adding, because if we don't have that, we're not going to have a clear essay. Okay, so this idea of what it feels like, what it means. You can say, yeah, this is my experience with language, but you need to say, this is what it feels like for me. This is what it means for me. This is how this experience has affected me. Let's look at some other examples that I have of theses. I have pairs of theses. What is a good thesis and what's a bad thesis? So, my brothers and sisters and I all speak English fluently, but our parents cannot. And obviously it's about English and what that so it fits the topic. But let's look at this one. I feel separated from my parents because they cannot speak English very well, and my Korean is not as good as I wish it were. However, my brothers and sisters can all speak English fluently, and this has caused a strange split in our family that caused a great deal of tension. All right, which one do we think is better? Right, hopefully you said that B is better because you can see how it is going to talk about it has caused a strange split, right? It caused a great deal of tension, right? That's what this whole thing feels like. You'll notice that it's longer, but it's not just that it's longer, it's that it's longer and provides this extra information. Let's look at number two. When my grandmother was alive, she and I used to speak to each other in Spanglish. However, since she has died, I don't speak Spanglish to anyone else, which makes me feel as if I have lost a connection to my past. Spanglish is a mixture between Spanish and English that many people speak. Some people don't call it that. But that's a version that's a name that some people use. And so we have that, and we have my grandmother used to speak to me in Spanglish, but now that she's dead, I don't speak to anyone in that way. So let's see which one is appropriate for a thesis. All right, let's go to the next one. Since my brother is deaf, I grew up speaking sign language, but when he got older, he had a cochlear implant that allowed him to hear. However, we still communicate using sign language because it reminds me of how close we were growing up. A cochlear implant is a device that goes that's implanted into people's ears, and like in the back side of their head there, that allows them to hear. And sign language, by the way, it's interesting just to note that sign language, there is American Sign Language versus other sign language, right? And so there is a kind of an English sign language versus other sign language. Not all sign languages are the same. And sign language is really a very interesting thing. But in any case, we have that, and then we have the other one. My brother is deaf, so we communicate through sign language. Which one would be better for a 750-word essay? All right, and then number 4, the language that I learned growing up would definitely not be considered standard English. And then B, because I grew up not speaking standard English, I have never had much confidence in school. Sometimes I feel so insecure that I wonder if college is for me. Which one do we think is better? All right. So what you should have thought was better is all the just the easy way to talk about it, all the longer ones are better. Again, that it's not just because they're longer; it's because they have that information, the extra information in there, right? This strange split in our family, right? This makes me feel as if I have lost a connection to my past. That's you have to prove that, right? What does that mean to lose a connection to your past? What does it mean to remind us of how close we were growing up? I need to see what that was. What did you feel like when you were growing up? How has that kind of changed, and how does the language help bring you back to that? What does it mean to feel insecure about your language? Why do you sometimes feel that college isn't for you? Can you tell some stories about that provide some experiences? So all of the examples that are better provide an opportunity for the writer to begin to explain something in much greater detail, to be able to tell stories that prove that this is how they actually feel about something. And that's what we ultimately want to be having here. So keep all that in mind as you're having your thesis. So as you go to the next video, we're going to talk about your outline assignment. And in your outline assignment, I'm going to have you, one of the things you need to do is state your thesis very directly. And so be thinking about that, and then we'll talk in that next video about how to develop that thesis. How is it that you're going to provide information in the essay that is going to support your thesis?